What's up, guys? We're back with another video. I'm Joe. This is
Elio.
Gavin.
and we're going to talk about AI, kind of different things. A couple topics we have is Taylor Swift.
Yep, that's in the news.
Yeah, so like
The nudes are in the news.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure all the guys like nudes, but
that is the problem.
It's just mostly guys. But another topic we have is what?
Oh, right as I switched away from my notes, dude, you're killing me. So we're going to talk about fake nudes, digital provenance. So where did something come from? How do we know if it's legit or not? Probably get into a little bit of moderation and the mess we're seeing on X since they fired the entire moderation crew, pretty much. I think there might be one or two people still trying to delete fake stuff on Twitter. And then I think we're going to get into open source models and, time permitting, a little bit of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which has been really popular in the research community for the past, 6 months-ish?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
So
for the past 6 months about.
So let's jump in. Go right ahead.
All right, let's talk about Taylor Swift and the nudes. What'd you guys hear about Taylor Swift and the nudes? You know,
Do we want to give some general background? Or
Yeah,
the
give
thing-
some
the
general,
thing
give
that
some
bugged
general
me?
background. Go for it. Go for it.
So, people, if you anyone who remembers those old sci-fi magazines from the 50s, right? Oh, send away for your X-ray glasses. You could see right through clothing. So they, of course, never worked. That's not a thing you can do. And even if you did, it wouldn't look like you'd expect, right? You'd see straight through. Be a lot less entertaining.
See bones. See skeletons.
Oh, her skeleton's beautiful.
Does what it says on the
my
tin.
God.
X-ray glasses.
So we now have that technology, though, right? It's not actual X-rays, but with generative models, we can take basically anything and merge it to anything. And I was having this conversation with someone. They're like, yeah, but you could always do Photoshop. So what? And it's like, that's true. With enough skill, I could take someone's face and I could make a composite, but it takes skill because you have to make sure the lighting, the color temperature, the blend, it takes hours to days to make a really good Photoshop composite.
There's a hurdle to jump over. It's like locking your doors. It's like, well, yeah, but anybody with the lockpick can get through. It's like, yes, but there are more hurdles that person would have to go through.
but you can just hire somebody, an expert, right? And it could just be that easy.
Well, yeah, locksmiths do exist.
Right.
Yeah, and I was gonna, but that's a great point. Is yes, you could hire someone, but locksmiths don't f around, right? They are licensed, and if they start breaking into too many houses, like more than a handful, it's going to get noticed. And there's ways to deal with someone who's a professional misbehaving that are a lot better than just the general public misbehaving.
Exactly.
So that's what we're facing now. You finally do have this ability. You don't have to hire anyone. And CoffeeZilla, right? The guy who, I forget how he started. It was not like scam busting.
He was an internet commentator for a while, and then he got like really heavy into the scam busting, and then like completely blew up when crypto was really getting big.
Yeah,
because he does really good like deep dive investigative journalism, especially in the crypto space.
Yeah, anyone who's not following CoffeeZilla, check him out because it is incredible. He's done some of the best scam busting for FTX and some of these other sketchy organizations. Yep. So he had a great point. There was a podcast interview that I was watching where they were interviewing him.
Oh. Okay.
And he was talking about this. He's like, a lot of the stuff where we've broken these cases, he's like, the best evidence we get that like takes these scams and lets us just obliterate them is someone's pissed, right? Like we decide, the three of us are like, oh, dude, let's go run this. We got all this AI. We could run a scam and make all this money, and it's going really well. And then you and I are like, dude, like, what if we cut Joe out? Like,
right.
Like, dude, like we don't like. Why are we giving him a third, man? Like, what if we just split? We'll give him like 5%, and like, what's he gonna do about it? And so Joe now is like, dude, this is messed up. I mean, we're doing awful things, but I want my third. I'm not taking these risks for nothing.
Right.
And so those people are the ones generally that come forward and actually share the internals and really help these investigations. And so having more than one person involved is actually kind of a safety check for society.
Yeah.
And now, as he was pointing out, you don't need a person involved. You can automate the whole thing.
Yeah. I remember it was a couple of years ago, there was a tool, it was supposed to be a phone app that was called Deep Nude. And basically it would do deep fakes of nude images. And so they released it, they pulled it from the market and basically said, like, no, there's actually a lot of ethical concerns around this.
Yeah.
Beyond that, the next step in that narrative history is Pornhub. People were uploading Pornhub with like Emma Watson. They would take her face, put it on like a porn star, And then you would have a whole video of this stuff. And so
Yeah.
eventually the US government kind of picked up and figured like, all right, you know what, let's classify the deep fakes as like revenge porn. We're still seeing it and it is still a problem, but like some of this regulation and enforcement has kind of curved that a little bit.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, like, why can't you just do Photoshop? You can do Photoshop, but it's hard to do Photoshop with a whole video. We can do it with a whole video. That now has some like legal ramifications. Images you can still do, but it's also classified as revenge porn, which is now a felony in the US.
Nice.
So it's a problem that's going to persist because you also have to look at like, how does this impact the individuals, right? Like this is somebody whose entire life has been ruined because people won't stop harassing her, won't stop posting nude photos of her online.
I want to take a minute to talk about, like, this is hitting the news big now.
Yeah.
Because Taylor Swift is an extremely recognizable name globally, right? But this has been happening for over the last
years.
6. Well, oh yeah.
Yeah, it's been happening.
I've seen stories even in the relatively common press of high schools, especially in England. I think there was one or two in the US where like this is so simple, so easy to do now that high school boys can just take pictures of classmates. And there have been a number of stories of girls who are underage, and there's all these fake images out there.
Yeah.
And it kind of was on the radar a little bit, right? Like people were talking about it, and it's horrible that this happened to Taylor Swift. But in another way, like it's finally getting the level of awareness where we're discussing this as a society rather than kind of like whispers down here. And now it's like, oh, wait, this is a problem. We should address this. And unfortunately, like as humans, we don't solve problems before they're huge problems. We got to wait till something goes horribly wrong before we'll deal with it.
Well, and in this context as well, like it's kind of more waves. Like I said, we started with deep nudes and then it moved to Pornhub and then it moved to like now we're talking about Taylor Swift. But this is at least the third time that this has happened.
Yeah.
On a grander scale. So I think it's going to continue to be persistent. Personally, I'm not super worried about deepfakes. That can be a whole nother conversation we get into. But like this is one of those few times that I am worried about deepfakes because you can start targeting individuals.
Yeah.
Like celebrities, sure. But what about ex-girlfriends?
Yeah.
What about politicians?
Yeah.
And so now we start getting into like, all right, what's the social ramifications of some of this? Like, is it harmless fun or is this something that can actually like be classified as a form of abuse or harassment?
Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing, there was an interesting idea put forth a few years ago that it's being weirdly applied because you are seeing it in other contexts, but you're not seeing it in kind of the deep fakes, deep nudes context. And I'd love to get some people on who have background in forensics and court cases. I have a specific person in mind, and also some women who may have dealt with some stuff that, to get some actual, firsthand knowledge. But one thing, they're like, well, once this is so easy, now suddenly you can just say, if you did actually leak a naked picture, like a real naked picture you got out, you're like, no, it's a deep fake. Right? Theoretically, you're like, it's not me.
The non-repudiation.
And no one could really repudiate that except like an intimate partner, right? Could be like, nope, that's not what she looks like, right? But
I think what we can do, what kind of makes that difference, because I've heard that argument a lot, like, oh, it's not me, it's deep fake, it's AI. It's like, no, but like there's a paper trail behind it. Remember?
Interesting.
I don't remember the official name for it, but people called it like the fappening back in
2015. Yes.
Yeah, where
the big iPhone breach, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was iCloud. It was iCloud breach.
Yeah.
Like somebody who's putting that out on the internet can show the receipts and say, no, this is actually from iCloud. Here's what's going on. And then, of course, we can start adding in like deep fakes and stuff like that. And now people have to discern like, oh, here's a whole bunch of nude pictures that are like real. And it's like, no, half of these are real. Half of these are fake. But at this point, I haven't seen anybody try that as a legitimate defense, saying like, oh, this is... I've seen politicians try it.
So,
but
and that's
I
what I
haven't
was saying.
seen, but like that's politicians will say anything they want, right? Like, hell, we're still having people like disagree about whether or not the 2020 election was real, or like whether or not January 6th was a riot. Like, people will just say whatever to get out of it. But I haven't seen it get to a point where we're worried about people saying, "Oh, well, that wasn't me. That was a deep fake," as a legitimate defense.
Now, what's really interesting though. For people, no. But everyone's worried about various conflicts going on right now. People are like, oh God, they're going to make false images and like try to delegitimize certain conflicts and wars.
Right.
And so we haven't really seen too much of that.
Oh, we've seen a lot of it.
Oh, well, the stuff.
The
stuff I've seen, it's not been people generating like a brand new deep fake of the war. It's like, oh, here's a picture of a previous conflict from 20, 30 years ago. And so that you don't need, machine learning to do that, to misattribute a picture, to use the wrong picture. Yeah. But what we have seen is we've seen people saying, no, that's not a real picture for the ones that are real. And they're like, no, that's a deep fake. And it's like, no, that's a real picture. And so it's interesting that in the realm of warfare, in propaganda and warfare, we completely have seen that. No, that's computer generated. Don't believe it. But when it comes to nudes, no one's tried that. It's not an acceptable excuse. So I don't know if that goes to psychology or sociology. And again, looking at around the world, we have very different, much more Puritan attitudes in the U.S. So that would be really interesting to talk to, again, a sociologist, psychologist, like, why are we seeing this defense used extensively in warfare, but almost not at all in, in the deep nudes kind of realm?
Let me ask you, do you have social media, right?
I'm basically on LinkedIn. I have a Facebook account that I have not logged on to in about a decade, and I don't plan to. And I had a whole thing that I wish I had told people, like, don't close your account because then they can hide that. Just stop using it. Maybe put up a profile picture saying this is a dead or inactive account, just to show, so it's hard to hide how many people are leaving social media. But anyway, so I have LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on TikTok or any of that garbage. Just LinkedIn occasionally because, professional network.
I know you're on Instagram. What else do you have?
YouTube. I got YouTube.
You don't have LinkedIn?
I got X.
I guess that's
Twitter.
social media, right? There's
of course
comment
it's social
section.
media.
I don't think YouTube's
How is it
social
not? It's YouTube is social media.
Me personally, I don't think that is.
All right, this is gonna be like the next version. Like, is YouTube social media?
Well,
No, so if you want to follow me on socials, NetSec Explained on YouTube, and then at GT Klondike on Twitter.
Oh God. Well, my question was,
how are
you keeping up with the information? Like, I've seen a lot of deepfakes on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. Like one of them was Biden fighting, Trump.
Yeah.
So those deepfakes.
So
how are you seeing your
my news sources? I guess I have three primary news sources, and that's kind of a lie because all three of these are aggregators. So Hacker News, because I'm in tech, and Hacker News is actually, a lot of people have denigrated as being kind of like incomplete or biased. It's a lot broader. If you actually spend some time on there, it's not just tech news. There's a lot of sociology, psychology, law. Like, there's a lot of good stuff that people in other fields, people I talk to who have backgrounds in law, who have backgrounds in poli-sci, like the stuff they reference, like the blog, like Ken White's blog and stuff, that constantly gets posted on Hacker News. So first of all, Hacker News, I've been doing that, and I found this other cool little thing called ProgScrape that scrapes Hacker News and Lobsters and Reddit and like several others. And so I've been using kind of that more because now it's an aggregator of aggregators.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I've been doing is I have on my phone and on my computer, I have an RSS reader, which RSS was like taking over the internet. And then you can't really advertise or shove junk in there. So it kind of died back out. But I have an RSS feed, so every time I find a really good blog, like Ken White, like Popat, right, I will go ahead and I'll add that feed to my RSS reader, and so I'll check the three of those. And so the RSS feed is stuff that I have decided, this is always really good stuff. I want to keep up with this. So none of those is a first order source. Those are all aggregators that cover a whole variety of sources. And then the other thing I'll do is when I find a good article, a lot of times they'll be like, and then read this and this and this, and I'll hop to those links. And sometimes like, I'm going to add this one to the RSS aggregator. So that's where I get my news from, is a variety of sources through these aggregators primarily. Oh, and NPR. Listen to that sometime.
I have a whole funnel. I'm the guy that stays up till like 2:00 in the morning researching crap. I have a whole funnel in like how I get my information. So usually it starts with, if the story is going to be big enough, people are going to be talking about it. So I'll start on social media. I'll go on Reddit. There's a lot of really good, like, well-moderated Reddits, like Out of the Loop, Explain Both Sides, Change My View. Neutral Politics used to be one of mine, but it's like they shut down a while ago. They reopened, but they're nowhere near like what they used to be. But I try to go to like more neutral sources. Like, people are asking these questions. So Reddit will be one. Sometimes I'll see stuff on Twitter. And then I'll start digging into it, and then I'll go to like more reputable sources. So first I'll see like, okay, here's the social media, here's what people are talking about, here's kind of like the conversation around it. Then I'll go to just general, like, what am I finding online? Because sometimes I'll find articles on like New York Post or like heavy right-wing publications or heavy left-wing publications like Vox. And then I'm like, okay, so there's at least some kind of story here, but like, what's the more precise version of it? So the point where I usually stop is when I see a convergence or I see stuff around local news.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll see stuff. There was a video that I saw, a really good example. There was a video I saw a number of years ago. It was like kids riding around on bikes and they were being arrested by cops. And so the narrative is like, oh, they didn't have licenses for their bikes. And I'm like, all right, that's a little weird.
Where
like,
is this?
Wait,
let me look.
Dirt bike?
Yeah.
No, bicycles.
Yeah.
Yeah. It started on Facebook. It was Now This made like a 2.5 minute video, but they kept looping the same 45 seconds and like trying to say like what the problem is. And they like clearly framed what was going on. And so I'm looking at it and I was like, okay, like what's the actual story? So I went to, it was in I think New Jersey. So I went to like a New Jersey local newspaper for that city. And got a little bit more of a complete idea as to like what was going on, but they didn't say like why the kids were actually being arrested. They just said like, hey, and they could tack this on. They were warned because of this, but like they didn't actually arrest these kids or like pull them over because they didn't have licenses. I was trying to figure out like, okay, well, where did this video come from? So we went online. There were some people on Reddit who actually found the source creator of the video because it was one of the kids riding around on bikes. It was a 20-minute video that Now This cut down to 45 seconds, and then they looped that to make it a 2.5-minute video.
Yeah.
That 20-minute video showed about 50 kids like riding through traffic, like messing with people in this small town. That's why the police got involved. So the police start kind of like chasing them down. They start running from the cops. Eventually they split up, they get caught. And that's when Now This actually like cut the video. So it's only about 10 kids being like talked to by the police officers. And it's like, okay. And one of them got arrested. And it's like, okay, why did only one get arrested? Why didn't all of them get arrested? Like clearly there's an outlier here. And of course the kid was black and the cop was white. And this was like 2020. Yeah. So that was part of the narrative. And it's like, okay, so what actually happened? Again, I researched this crap. This is like how every single story that I come across that I find interesting, like this is the level of detail I go into. It's like what actually happened was these kids were basically harassing this town. They were running from the cops. Eventually they split up. Some got caught. One of them kept talking back to one of the cops. And so she's like, all right, I'm just going to bring you in and your parents are going to have to pick you up from the station. So he wasn't like arrested so much as like just detained. Yeah. And so that's how I get my news. Not everybody can do that.
So I want to back over a bit.
Yeah.
She arrested him for talking back. Isn't there freedom of speech?
Yes,
to a degree.
But when you're talking to a federal officer or police officer, there's, I don't know all of the statute, but you can be charged with obstructing an investigation. There are a few things that you have to provide, and if you don't, then that's obstruction.
But that gets into the legal bit. Like you can be detained for whatever reason. Yeah. They can pull you over for probable cause. Like I don't know if you did a crime, but I think you might have, so now I can go and talk to you. And then if there's any legitimate reason, like they can detain you for up to like 24 hours. But in that case, it was just, I'm going to make your parents pick you up.
And again, I don't know. Like you can always ask, am I being detained? Because I don't believe Miranda rights kick in until
you're being arrested.
Yeah, until you're being arrested and you're being like, you have to be read in, right?
Yeah.
So like kind of, and this is where a lot of like the sovereign citizens don't have legal backgrounds. They're like, traveling. I don't have to do this. And it's like, well, yeah, you do. Like you can move to another country, go to Sealand or something, and you don't have to when you're on the little rig. But like, yeah, you're in the U.S. Guess what? You're still under our laws. So.
Yeah. So a lot of the issues are, you have a lot of these stories that get chopped up into little segments.
Yeah.
Which they look like the officer's tyrant or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have a lot of like minorities, black, brown, whatever.
Yeah.
And you see these justice warriors in social media. They want to fight back and they start these organizations and want to tackle down. When in reality, you don't know the whole story.
Yeah. I mean, that's the easiest way to manipulate, right? This is why in court, when you swear in, the truth, the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
And nothing but, right?
Yeah.
And so we've known for a long time how you manipulate, and we just don't apply that to the public sphere.
Shit, we had a lot of yellow journalism. Like, we got into wars because of it.
Yeah.
What was it? The Spanish-American War or something like that? Bay of Pigs? Like, we've gotten into wars because of yellow journalism. But, First Amendment, freedom of press.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've gotten into, what was it?
Weapons of mass destruction.
I heard something, it was like the last... We lied our way into like 4 of the last 6 wars we've been involved in. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, totally made up. I think it was the Philippine War, U.S. Philippine War. Like that was we were lied into. It's just I'm not gonna get into the politics of it all, but like yes,
not a geopolitics.
propaganda is a
podcast.
thing, and then you have let's talk about straw man arguments. Like here is the left, whatever the hell that means, and then here is the right, whatever the hell that means, and the left is going to misrepresent or straw man as many of the right positions as they can, and then the right's going to do that, and then that like permeates into the media, and it's really fascinating to see this happen in real time because like we're separating essentially what reality is. There's a term I heard about this term. I had to look it up because it sounded absolutely insane. It was during the Bush administration. It was one of the staffers at the Bush administration said like, "Oh, well, your problem is that you're living in an evidence-based reality." There's a wiki page for this. Like this is an actual
amazing.
conversation
That's
somebody
amazing.
had. But like
that's
where we're starting to see a lot of like this kind of division. And then you take AI. AI is not going to cause the problem. It's an accelerant. Like it's just pouring jet fuel onto this fire. And so that's probably some of the stuff that we're going to see. But that ties back into what you were saying about the deepfakes. Like, hey, here's a war that's going on, but let's take video game footage and say like, oh, well, this is what Hamas is doing. And it's like, no, it's not. But we see it back in like 2019 at the AI Village. We had a whole panel and a number of talks because that was kind of our focus is like ethics in AI. And this is where I was no longer worried about deepfakes because you'll see just general propaganda, like in India, for example. Like there's a huge contention between like Muslims and Hindus, and a lot of it is like rural communities. So what you'll see is somebody posting on WhatsApp. That's like the main communication channel. It's kind of like you'll see the same false information on Facebook. Somebody will post on WhatsApp and they'll take a video of somebody getting lynched in like one city or in one like village and say like, oh, it's this guy, like he's responsible, and then they'll get lynched, like somebody will get lynched in another town, and then they'll record that video. So a really good example would be like a Hindu group will like lynch a Muslim, and then they'll take that video and say like this was Muslims lynching a Hindu, and then more Hindus will lynch Muslims, and like it feeds into itself. There is no element of truth here. It's just like crap on top of crap on top of crap. Deepfakes doesn't cause this. We can do all of this without deepfakes. So this is why I'm not worried about deepfakes, right? It's like trying to hunt chickens with a nuclear bomb. It's like, yeah, you'll get them. Like it does the job, but so does something a little bit smaller. Like you don't need a deepfake to do any
extra
of this
crispy
stuff.
fried.
Now I want to amend that statement because deepfakes, you need to be careful because like deep nudes, like revenge porn, that is a real thing, and you could just flood it on the internet. And like you can't ban ideas, you can't ban information. And so what happens is like if I can't post it on Facebook or TikTok or Snapchat or Twitter or wherever, then I'm going to post it on 4chan. If I can't post it on 4chan, then I'm going to post it on some of those other shady sites. And then people are going to go to those shady sites and be like, oh, look at this evidence that I have.
So I will agree with you, but I will also say, going back to what we were saying earlier, there is a kind of dynamics, like social dynamics and general dynamics. There's actually an old, I guess it's a Russian saying. I forget where I first heard this, but quantity has a quality all its own.
Right.
And so, yes, like you said, we've been able to do all this misinformation and disinformation and all this kind of manipulation, right? It's not new. It's been going on for probably, I would say, not even decades, centuries, if not millennia.
Oh, yeah.
But the ability to do it very easily and very quickly and one person, like there's a thing I've always mentioned, like I've called it the blast radius problem. Right? Throughout human history, how much damage can a single individual do to the rest of society? And you go back to like Stone Age times, right? Where there's very little technology, people with, clubs and basic weapons. And like one really strong dude can go freaking nuts and just start killing people from the tribe. But there's going to be, maybe he kills 10, maybe 5-10 people. And at some point, the rest of the tribe is going to be like, no. And then they're going to band together and take him out. And problem solved. So the blast radius is limited to, I don't know, dozen-ish people. So that's the issue, is that blast radius, as you have more and more technology, right, you can harm more and more people. Because the thing that's a constant, you will always have some amount of unbalanced individuals due to genetics, due to, just how they're raised, due to all kinds of environmental, genetic, etc. So that becomes more and more risky. As one person can do more damage to more of society, then how do you deal with that? And like you mentioned nuclear, but nuclear is hard. Like technically nuclear is not hard. If you get enough your enriched fission products, you just literally put them in a pile and then it just wipes out a city. That's really hard to do, really expensive. So we do all this fancy stuff to like make it cheaper to make, H-bombs. But again, all of that is really, really, really hard to do and really expensive. You need very specialized gear and centrifuges and all this. So it's pretty easy to like know who's up to that and just screw up their plans for the most part. But you look at like biological, it's not that hard to grow a whole bunch of anthrax or some other nasty stuff or just rosary peas in your garden, right? And come up with large amounts of highly toxic materials. Nature has furnished us with a lot of this. But where it gets really interesting is when we start talking about robotics and AI, as you've always had to convince people, because genocide, I think today is what Holocaust Remembrance Day. One thing that I think it would help us to think a little more critically about is it wasn't just the Holocaust, right? Genocide is kind of humanity's hobby. I actually looked into this last week, and you know how many mass killings, not technically genocides, but somewhere where a ton of people are being killed, you know how many separate instances are going on around the world right now?
I know 4 off the top of my head.
Right now.
Yeah.
What are they?
Yemen, Israel, Gaza.
Yep. Okay.
Technically, people might get mad at this. Uyghurs in China, and damn it, I had a 4th one. I can't remember.
Oh, don't worry. And the ones you mentioned, I was expecting those to be listed. Those weren't even listed. Those are still kind of contested, right?
Yeah.
So, like right now, the ICJ just said, "Hey, Israel, please don't do a genocide," but they didn't say do a ceasefire either. So none of those are the 20 I'm talking about, and I forget we'll have to post the link. I forget the group, but they track this, and they have a whole map with predictions of where mass killings are likely to break out next. So none of those are included in the 20. So it's like 24 events right now in various parts of Africa. I can't remember, somewhere in South America and China potentially. Depending how you define this. So this stuff is getting easier and easier. And speaking about China, right, they have used these technologies. You have to install an app that tracks everywhere you go. And so it makes it like it used to be you had agents that if you want to track someone who is sketchy, you're like, I think this guy's plotting against our country. But you have 50 agents. So choose carefully who you task out an agent to follow. And now you don't have to. The ease with which you can dig through evidence and follow someone around makes it a much larger threat where you can surveil a whole population where before you could maybe do 50, maybe 100 people. So
I saw your alarm go off.
Yeah, we're coming up on half an hour, so we'll have to break and then continue.
Is it similar to like the social credit?
Social credit is part of what I'm talking about, but there's
what
actually
I mean is like how they monitor them.
Yes, that is part of it.
Yeah.
But if you're a Uyghur in China, there are extra applications that you install that track. You have to basically check in and checkpoint, and they track you all the time. And if you don't install that, they will put you somewhere else where they don't need that installed into one of the many buildings.
In states?
I mean, there are a lot of people that are like, we can't even do a national ID because people are so paranoid about that. Like, this is why we use social security numbers, which are garbage IDs. Like it used to say right on the card.
Yeah, they're not supposed to be used as IDs.
It's not an ID. So, I mean, some people would love that, but probably not, or I don't know. It's worth keeping an eye on.
I don't think it'll happen in the U.S.
I would agree.
Right. How about we take a break?
Yeah.
Let me go check.
All right, and then we'll do part 2.
Yeah. That kind of goes into
You
details
mentioned
about
that.
this.
I gotta get
And
that.
we're
'cause
back.
You mentioned it several times.
Am I still going on my rant?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, yeah. So,
Just make it short.
all right. What's our next topic?
It's open source
models.
model.
Source models. All
Yeah,
right.
that was
And
our
then
next one.
training data.
Yeah, so there's an interesting conversation going around right now about like open source models because we have Llama, we have Alpaca, we have Dolphin, we have all sorts of like new open source models, Mistral, Mixtral, like you can run them locally, you can download them. The argument is that they're not open source unless you open source the training data as well. And there's a lot of challenges to open sourcing training data because a lot of these places kind of get their training data from like really sketchy places. But the other thing is like the training data is essentially the secret sauce that like makes the model. So that's really difficult to do. Or you run into copyright issues, right? So say I authorize you to scrape my website and get this information, but I don't authorize you to share that with people.
Yeah.
So you're allowed to train your model on my information, but you're not allowed to share the specific information that you pulled. to everybody else.
And OpenAI is running face first into that with the New York Times lawsuit. So.
Yeah, they're running face first with the New York Times lawsuit. Midjourney's gotten hit with a number of lawsuits for the same reason, another generative.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to open source models, a lot of them are also built on top of these closed source models. So like you can only open source them so much. You can only reveal so much information.
Isn't there one extra issue there? Because I saw one article, and this goes back to something months ago. We had lunch or dinner, I think, and you were telling me about this. When you train a model, there's also an initial randomization of the weights in the model.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you had all the code and you had all the data, if you don't have the random seeds, will you get the exact same model?
Well, you can return the random seeds.
But can you ever actually? And you've also said previously that like the order you feed the data in changes too. So because this article is like, look, if you can't fully replicate the model and all the model weights, it's not open source. So even with everything you're saying with the code and the data, is it an open source model? It'll be a similar model.
You would have to have the data in the same order being fed in during training. You would have to set the epoch size and the batch size the exact same, and then you would have to have the random seed the exact same. But I think when it comes to random seeds, because we see this with like more traditional machine learning, I think even when it comes to random seeds, like you don't need that.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're going to create a model off of MNIST is like handwritten digits that you can use to train like
OCR.
an image recognition model. Yeah. So I can give you the data. I can give you the algorithm, right? So you could use like a more traditional approach, like a basic neural network, or you can use a convolutional neural network. I can give you all that information. I can give you all the parameters that I set. You can still create a different model by like changing up the way that the data is fed. So like, yeah, there is a little bit of randomization, but I don't think that randomization makes it any less open source. I think it's the training data itself that people are complaining about.
So has anyone actually done, going to science and replication, and it's hugely expensive to train these things, has anyone actually taken the same code and the same data and fed it in different orders and like trained the same model 3 or 4 different times and then compared how it responds to different questions? Has that been done? I'm gonna guess no.
The only thing that I know that has done this is one paper that had talked about, and I don't even really like this paper, to be honest.
Okay.
But it was one paper that talked about how you can change the output of the model based on the order that the information's been trained. Now, the thing that I don't like about this paper is they were trying to like pitch it as like, oh, this is a cybersecurity issue. This is how you can hack a model. And I was like, you're an idiot. But that's the only reference that I'm aware of where people have done that, because what's the point? Like what are you showing with that? Yeah. And I don't think that there's enough of a motivation to say like,
I think this ties into
anything useful.
Slightly different, but I think it's important, perfect time to bring it up, is Max Tegmark's research on, I believe the term was mechanistic interpretability. And like, oh my God, this is going to be so good. If we're able to achieve this, it's going to be so good.
What is it?
The idea is you train a model using machine learning, which is really good. Here's a huge pile of data, high dimensionality, find all the patterns. And you take that, and it's still a little iffy. Like I've noticed this just working on the demo that I'm working with, that you're asking me to set up.
Yeah, that workshop. Yeah.
One time I asked it, what is a pyrosome? Pyrozome. And I got nothing. It's like, I don't know. And then I asked, so I went to show that off just a day or two ago.
Right.
And it's like, oh, and it actually got it with a spelling error because it's Pyrosome. And so I'm seeing inconsistent behavior with OpenAI on trivial stuff. And so if you can never really trust it, like, do you really want this driving cars? Like Tesla's killed, 74 people or something? It's at least 50. I think it's 74 at this point. Anyway, so what if you could take those model weights, you could take the effective, like what this code does, and pull that out of the model, put it into a traditional like software architecture where you can then formally verify and prove this always does the thing it does every single time. Like that would be incredibly useful, because then you could use the speed of finding the patterns via AI, but have the reliability of something that's actually like traditional formally verified software.
Yeah, and there have been a lot of conversations about that in more traditional machine learning circles. Like years ago, I was part of a conversation where we were talking about interpretability and why that's important, right? Because if your doctor uses some sort of AI or machine learning system to prescribe you a medication, they're kind of on the hook, so they're liable. So they can't use a neural network because neural networks are black boxes. But they can use like a decision tree. and then they can actually trace with their finger how it came to that decision and then decide whether or not that's the correct decision. Whereas a neural network, like, I don't know, there was just some random like sub network in there that just went completely off the rails, and that's why you're getting prescribed
and
whatever.
It could be something like the famous one. This is old, but the famous one with the sheep, right? Like recognize the sheep, and it like, oh yeah, that has sheep, and then I think they use lime or something. Like what feature is tracking, and it's it's the field.
Yeah.
The sheep are always in a field. There's never a picture of sheep like not in a field. So when I see a field, sheep. So it could be the same thing in medicine. That'd be really dangerous, where it's like these conditions typically go together.
We have seen that. Yeah, there was we're tracking skin cancer, and it noticed 100% of the time which one was skin cancer, and it was because the skin cancer had a ruler next to it. And so it'll pick up on things like that.
That's amazing.
My favorite is like back in the 80s, like more classical image recognition. They were trying to determine like tanks versus cars.
Yeah.
And it turns out the tanks were in a field, the cars were on a road. But when you put a tank on the road, it's a car. And it's like, wait, what? Yeah. So it'll just like converge to the most common denominator.
Yeah.
And so that's why like variations are important. But this is also why like one of the things that we talk about quite a bit at the AI Village is like AI and ethics, because some of the data sets are historical. So where did we get this information? It's like, here's a data set of faces that are 98% like white. But that's why like black people can't unlock their iPhones.
Well, or if you're Chinese, I remember one of the flaws in Face ID was any Chinese or
Asian faces couldn't unlock it, and so like
to the iPhone, all Asians look the same. So, iPhone's racist.
Yeah, so this is kind of where we're taking like more of a practical. No, he just hates Mexicans. But like this is where like the political side, people are like talking about woke and all this stuff. It's like no, like for practical reasons, like we need to diversify our data set, because and how our data is being collected is going to start impacting us on a day-to-day basis. Like there was a company, I can't tell you who it was, but they had a hiring platform. Basically, it'll read a resume and then determine whether or not this person will be passed off to an interview. And then they actually did an analysis, and it turns out the two biggest factors to determine whether or not you're being passed off to an interview is whether or not your name is Jared and you played lacrosse. And so, like, this is bias built into AI. And so it's like, no, like, we need to fix it.
Ivy League bias.
Yeah. What gets even more interesting is, I don't want to go back to, like, the actual topic we're talking about. What gets even more interesting is, hey, let's not investigate what the underlying social implications of what the AI is revealing in the data that we have and the data that we collect. Let's just fix the bias in the model. So it goes back to
that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, isn't it?
Because there's so many ways that bias can leak into a model.
Yeah,
and that would be no one's done that, have they? Where it's like, let's train a model and see what its biases are as a way of exposing societal biases.
But then what do you do with that?
Wouldn't it depend on the coder?
Yeah, that's the problem.
It would depend on how the data is collected.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So if it's in a province,
but also it's not just how the data is collected. Like if you look at like redlining. Like, oh, wow, black people in crime. It's like, well, because you forced them to live in areas that are lower end. So there's more, like, this is a thing that society created. Yes, there's a correlation there.
And then there's a downstream effect.
But the causality caused that correlation, right? It's not an innate thing. It's a cause of policy.
So here's an example of like how it'll start impacting us in the real world. So this is a tool. I don't know if it's still being used by police forces, but it was rolled out to certain police districts where we're going to look at where the most frequent arrests are occurring, and then we're going to feed that into our model, and that's going to tell us where we put more police officers. So now we're putting more police officers in places where more arrests are happening.
So there's more
arrests happening. Which means that there's more arrests happening.
You just set up a positive feedback.
You created a feedback loop.
And again, even if the criminality, like the rate of crime, even if that's identical, right, you're going to get more arrests where there's more officers.
Right.
So you've already created this system. So that'd be interesting to use.
And
AI
that's
to
the downstream effect, because then you got to look like what caused the arrests, and then obviously more crime. It's like, okay, but what caused the crime? Likely more poverty. What caused the poverty? And then you start mapping it over like a black and brown neighborhood maps, and you start to see like these correlate very heavily, like suspiciously heavy. So when it comes to machine learning and AI, like nothing is ever 100%. Rarely are things like above 80%. And so when it gets super high, like when you start getting like 90, 95% 99% correlation, like you got to kind of like raise an eyebrow and be like, what else is it tracking? It's like you said, sheep in a field. Is it tracking the sheep? Is it tracking the field?
Yeah.
And so like that's where data scientists know this, and data scientists have been like talking about these things. Of course, like there's other stuff that gets in the way, politics, business drivers, things of that nature. But like I find it very difficult to have some of these conversations because people will point and be like, oh, you're being woke. It's like, no, I'm looking at stats.
Yeah.
Like we have certain biases.
And
we have survival biases. We have selection biases. We have like recency biases. And so we need to kind of identify and field those out. You can't go in with like completely colorblind because you go in ignorant.
And so
you got to like counteract those biases.
Yeah. So I agree. And but what you said, data scientists and statisticians, right, and a few other people in the sciences deeply understand these biases and these flaws.
Yeah.
And there's some mathematical illusions and hallucinations that happen. I'm not talking AI, just math itself.
Like
the flaw of averages. And that's the problem, is we have very low science literacy. And so I had a friend that I've known him for a really long time, and interesting guy. He's had some major life changes over the past 2 decades. And we got together. This is really awkward because we got together for dinner, and one of my board members, who's African American, amazing guy. Like I pulled him onto my board because he was so solid, like just rock solid dude, really good morals. And so we're all at dinner, and this former friend from way back, he starts slowly. I'm like, well, that's weird. That's an interesting statement. That's a little bit alt-righty, right?
Yeah.
And as the night goes on, he's getting deeper and deeper into the alt-right stuff. And I'm bringing this up because this is a programmer. This is a man who gave me a 3-hour, we had a phone call going deep into the computer science of Lisp. This is not an idiot. And yet he believed stupid things, where he actually, in front of this other friend of mine, he's like, IQ is really important. First of all, no, it's not. I'm not going to go into that rant right now. IQ's garbage, right? There's so many problems with the IQ test. And so he's like, IQ correlates directly with race. And it's like, no, it doesn't. It does correlate a little bit because of flaws in the test, but even the test itself is deeply flawed. Testing is just an endeavor that we rely on metrics way too much, and we lack context, and we don't understand what you're saying. We don't understand some of the flaws and biases and problems. And so I'll finish this thought up, because how do we fix this? How do we fix the issues you're talking about?
Right.
I think the only fix, everyone wants to individualize the problem and just be like, oh, we need to do better. It's like, no, this is a systemic issue. We need to get people generally in society.
Yeah.
If we want society to work out, people need to have some understanding of these flaws and biases, so that when stuff is put in front of them, right, we can't, right now it's not working. To debunk all of these bullcrap claims is not working. It doesn't scale. We need people to have an innate ability to say, wait a minute, that claim you're making that IQ is correlated with race is bullcrap. And here's why. And I understand it's bullcrap.
Yeah.
And each person needs to be somewhat inoculated against these kind of mental distortions that we have, because it's just not working. There's no other way around it.
I think that's a little harder to do. So the one part that I am kind of sympathetic on, like that person, even though I disagree with the claim, is I can see like there are some people who, and to completely try and be as objective as I can and like remove any bias from like my next several statements, like there are some people that live in more of an evidence-based reality. So, and I'm using that not tongue in cheek. What I mean is like, if I can't see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, lick it, like, then I can't point to it and say that this is true. So like, that's the way this gets into like epistemology.
I'll
like, how do we know things?
Thoughts there. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
So there's like three groups that I'm going to point out. So like for this group, like, okay, they live in like this evidence-based reality. For the second group, they have assumptions. And so they're making these assumptions, and we can point out like, oh, these assumptions are faulty because of X, Y, and Z. But like they're making these assumptions, but assume these assumptions are true, then the logic follows.
It's a double assumption.
Well, right. But assume these assumptions are true, like then the logic follows.
Sure.
And so now you can kind of see like, okay, this is a logical person. They just have like different baggage and background than I do.
Epistemology, there's some missing steps there.
It's exactly epistemology.
There's a gap between the evidence and the proper interpretation. There's the evidence, the collection of it, and the interpretation of it.
That's the third group that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is we have evidence and interpretation. The second group is assumptions over certain pieces of evidence or even counterexamples. But the interpretation, assuming this is correct, the interpretation makes sense. The third group is those assumptions plus breaking evidence or breaking logic. So a really good example, and I'll always pick on these people, Flat Earth. So Flat Earth is great because you have a Flat Earth model that they have.
There's people who believe in Flat Earth all around the globe.
Oh, yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. All around the world. Say that again, but slower. Yeah. So they have a Flat Earth model. It's a little disc shape. And then you say, okay, how does a day-night cycle work? Because I go outside and I see the sun rises in the east, it sets in the west. Easy, right? What does that look like? And they'll take a little flashlight and they'll move it in a certain direction. It's like, awesome. Now, explain seasons. During summer, like June, July, August, it's longer days here, but it's shorter days in like Australia. Yeah. And it's the reverse during the winter, like November, December, January.
Exactly.
So how does that look? And they'll take the same flashlight and they'll move it in a different way. And it's like, okay, so we're taking that assumption, assume the earth is flat. What does that look like? And now we're looking at the logic, but it breaks. You can't have the same ball of light moving in two different ways at the same time. Yeah. And so, like, that's that third group that I'm talking about. So the second group you can actually work with, because now you got to identify, like, what are those assumptions, and now let's, like, actually put a little bit more evidence in there. So street epistemology is a great way to doing that. And it's not, like, you got to be ethical for all this stuff. I'm never, like, trying to change people's opinions on some of these things.
No, and I have a lot of respect for, like, the way you conduct discussions. Yeah. Some of it, I'm sure, comes through in the podcast, but some of the stuff we've had after the podcast. Yeah. I love watching your work because you are really good at kind of meeting someone where they're at. Yeah. And kind of letting them, very kind of Socratic, let them kind of come to the conclusion. Yep. And like, I'm not as good at that. Like, I'm less tolerant. I'm like, no, that's bullcrap. Here's why.
I've seen that.
Yeah. But a lot of respect for the way that, like, this is one of my favorite things is like you just really precise and really principled in the way you have discussions.
I try to be. I try to be as objective and as unbiased as I can be. Like, I have my own opinions, and you know, I gotta acknowledge that, but what does it look like if I zoom out and like move beyond myself? I had a discussion with somebody the other day, and this is, I think, like very pertinent to this conversation. I had a discussion with somebody the other day because they were a little bit more right-wing, like not super MAGA, but like definitely Trump supporter, and they were super happy about that. And it's like, cool, I'm not gonna tell you who to vote for, right? And so he was worried about AI, and he's like, oh, I noticed it's a little biased. Like, how come my iPhone, I type in president, it says Biden, and then it says Obama. How come it doesn't say Trump? Like, he was our most recent president. And it's like, I don't know iPhones. I don't know why that is. When it comes to AI, I can kind of explain why some people think it's biased, right? Like, you start asking questions about COVID, it's going to tell you, like, what the CDC says. Or you start asking questions about gender, it's going to tell you what, like, you know, more gender scientists will say. And so the reason is because, like, find anybody in this room. We were at a bar. It's like, find anybody in this room and, like, point to somebody who doesn't have bias. It's like, oh, no, we all have bias. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
But we need to acknowledge that. And then how do we minimize, because we can't get rid of bias, but we can minimize the impact that bias has. Yeah. So what does that look like? Google, whenever you do a Google search, they have this thing called Your Money, Your Life. When it comes to money or health, they only go to reputable sources. Now, you may agree or disagree with those reputable sources, but like there's a certain level of scrutiny that these sources go through in order to be page ranked on Google. And so you'll get things like CDC, of course, NIH. You'll also get, what's that website? WebMD. Because it's actually WebMD. Like they have good information.
I feel tired. You have cancer.
Yeah. The test is terrible. I had like a pain in. I had a pain in my foot. I had a pain in my foot, and I went on WebMD, and I was like answering the questionnaire. It said I had like cancer or I was pregnant, and I was like,
it always says you have cancer.
yeah. Because I mean, cancer's like, I'm a little tired today. It's like, oh, you might have cancer. That's a side effect. It's like,
I just burped.
What isn't a side effect? Yeah, what isn't a side effect of cancer? But like that's kind of the point, is like, let's minimize the impact of those biases. And so when it comes to things like a really contentious topic right now is like gender, I'm not going to make a value proposition on like what we should consider with gender, but like who should we listen to? Yeah. And so, like, that's where, here's anybody with a microphone can start a podcast, like and subscribe.
Not everyone has 3 microphones.
Not everybody has 3 microphones and 2 cameras.
There's 3 data points. Look at that. We're way more trustworthy.
And Joe. But so any asshole with a microphone can, like, start a podcast. Yeah. So that's probably not the person you should listen to. They might be right? A broken clock is right twice a day. So, like, they might be right on certain topics. But, like, what goes above that? It's like, oh, well, let's find somebody who's a little bit more credentialed. So here's somebody who has, like, a PhD that's actually studied this. But then, like, do they actually know what they're talking about? And then how do we know that? And that's where, like, the whole scientific process
don't necessarily want to get all the way into that right now. But you just saw the retractions from Harvard, right? There was some
That's
major,
the next part that I'm getting
right?
to.
So
Yep,
it's getting
yep,
harder
that's-
to just
that's-
say, just trust the science, because like stop screwing around.
Trust the science was a slogan, and if you
Ugh.
stop there, like that, the conversation shouldn't stop
Yeah.
at like trust the science, because
Yeah.
what the hell is science? Science is a process; it's
Oh,
not a
yeah.
conclusion.
Exactly.
So that's like where I'm getting to. Here's an asshole with a podcast. Probably don't want to listen to him. Here's somebody with a PhD. They've studied this stuff,
yeah.
but they can also be a quack. Like they can also say whatever they want, or they can like set up their. Because the way that academia is set up is like you're trying to get publications out, so they can like publish
There
as much
was
as they want, and
just-
it can be all like fictitious.
Just a study I just saw yesterday
Yeah.
about correlation of people promoting their study on Twitter, which is X Twitter now,
yeah.
and and how much they get cited, which is terrifying. But
Yeah.
go on.
No, there's definitely like that privacy effect, like, oh, I saw it on Twitter, so it must be interesting. Like it's just get stuff in your face. So the next level is where the whole scientific process makes sense. Because
Yeah.
I mean, shit, dude, there is an MD in Georgia whose official position is that diseases are caused by demon sperm entering the body.
Man, he is a man behind his times.
It's a woman, but like she
Oh,
is a doctor.
okay.
She is a doctor.
Okay,
She will treat your children if you go to her clinic. She is licensed, but like,
Poorly,
that's what I'm
but she
saying.
will
Like
treat
some
them.
some people can be quacks.
I mean,
some
that-
people
that-
can
that
be
was-
credentialed and quacks.
That
so
was
like,
what miasma. That was the whole the ether and all that. That's like she's that's several
yeah,
hundred
yeah,
years old.
it's a whole thing. So
It's
like
amazing.
that next level
Absolutely
is
amazing.
here's a bunch of here's where we start getting to like more consensus. Is like
Yeah.
here's a bunch of scientists doing their own independent experience, and it's like a court case. They're building up evidence,
Yeah.
and they're saying, hey, all of the evidence is pointing to X, Y, and Z. So here's the conclusion that we can naturally draw.
Yeah.
And then every new paper that comes out of it has to engage with that.
And that's where, so going back to what you were talking about Flat Earth.
Yeah.
So to me, yeah, science is a methodology of how do you, everyone has bias, everyone has their own
Yep.
perception that we perceive the world. You have to experience the world through your perception, and that
Yeah.
introduces flaws. So how do you get past that and try to find the reality underneath your perception, and regardless of what you want to think, but what actually is happening? And so there was actually an amazing thing, I think it was on Metabunk, about flat Earth stuff, just what you were
Mhm.
saying. What is the path of the sun? How can we make as simple as possible mathematical model to predict where the sun will be on a given date? And someone did this for flat Earth, and the equation is insane. And it's doing all this crazy crap.
Yeah, it would have to.
It's
It would have
just
to.
amazing. So, like, you can make a mathematical model, but it's so convoluted. And then you look at, like, well, what if the Earth was round and the sun was over here this far away and it was orbiting,
Yeah, it's
and
so
the
much
model's
simpler.
super clean and totally accurate? And
Then
so,
you get
to
to
me,
Occam's razor. Yeah.
to me,
Occam's
like,
razor.
that's what you do. That's the process of science. Is
Yeah.
you can put out all kinds of ideas, and it's worth entertaining a lot of them, at least initially. And then the work of science, the hard part that separates people, like I have a lot of ideas. I'm like, I think this is true. I don't follow those up with a 3 to 30 year study. That's what real scientists do. They're like, I'm now going to spend a huge chunk of my life actually collecting data, interpreting data, trying to falsify. Does this work? Does it falsify? Does this other thing falsify it? And building a model. And then ideally, if the science is good, you get a model that gives you some level of predictive power. And the closer it is to reality, like the old joke, all models are useful, but
Go for it.
Oh, no, go ahead.
You're because you always say this. All models are bad. Some models are useful.
Yeah, all models are wrong, but some
Yeah,
are
that
useful,
was
right?
it.
So it's how close is the model to the reality?
Yeah.
So go
I
ahead.
do have a question. If we go outside right now,
Yeah.
I'm not a flat earther, I'm not all that, but
Yeah.
if you go outside, you look up, you'll see the moon, right?
Okay.
Maybe depends on what
Sometimes,
time of day.
yeah, it depends on like the phases.
And it's vastly different day to day. That screwed up a photo shoot. I talked my way on the top of a building to get a really cool shot of the moon over Camelback, and I didn't take into account that the moonrise was 2 hours later. I'm like standing up there like an idiot. I'm like, oh.
Well, because I've seen it in the daytime. I mean, you look up,
Yeah,
sure.
you'll
Yeah.
see it.
Yeah.
Explain to me, why is it in the daytime? Isn't it supposed to be in like the opposite side of the world, or
No.
No,
how's that work?
the moon rotates the Earth in its own timing.
Yeah.
And the Earth rotates around, the
The
Earth
Earth's rotating around the
rotates
sun, and the
in
moon's
its
rotating
own
around
timing.
Earth.
And so
Yeah.
sometimes you'll have the moon right next to the sun from like your own perspective, and so that's why you can see the moon
Yeah.
during the day.
And every once in a while, it gets right in the way. You have a solar eclipse.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So-
yeah.
Yeah, but it is interesting looking at that. And we have models going back actually quite 1,000 years or so. People, and maybe even more, look at the Antikythera mechanism and Stonehenge and all this.
Yeah.
Like, people have been really interested because the moon, especially the moon, the sun, I guess arguably the sun a lot more so, right? If you gave up one of those two, we could live without the moon, but without the sun, we would definitely die. The Earth would freeze.
That would
and-
freak out our
Yeah.
tidal waves or our tides.
Yeah. But yeah, it makes like the tides come from the moon, so it's really important to understand how that works. So this is something that there's always some group of people in a society that, especially if you live by the ocean, have been super interested in knowing. And it's weird because today most people just don't have to think about this. And that's an interesting thing we should save for another episode.
Yeah, because I want to close the loop on my story.
Yeah, as knowledge becomes more accessible, we seem less likely to seek it. So anyway,
that is true.
Yeah,
the paradox of the modern age.
The world's weird, and the more you like try to the more layers you try to pull back, the more threads you pull on. Like it just gets weirder. It just gets
It's like
weirder.
an onion, and it makes you cry the more you look at it.
It
too.
does. It does. Anyway, so going back to the story, talking to this guy in the bar, pointing like everybody's biased, but how do we mitigate that bias? What OpenAI and some of these other models have decided to do is, hey, we're going to go with the closest thing that we have to a consensus.
Yeah.
And so what that's going to do is remove like our own personal biases. We may not agree on certain things, but that is going to be from an epistemological standpoint. Because, I mean, if we're going to try and create AGI, like artificial general intelligence, like we need to use intelligence to train it, whether or not we agree with that intelligence. And so it uses a lot of the closest to consensus we can get when it comes to science, or when it comes to observability and measurability and predictive power.
So I would argue that that's an important distinction, though, which is why I brought up what I did, is consensus doesn't necessarily map to fact or truth.
Well, and that's why I said as close as we can get to consensus.
Yeah.
Because consensus begins when science ends. And when science ends is basically like, there's nothing new we can say here.
Okay.
Yeah. So a really good example would be climate change. And this is something that I had to dig into. So climate change, so many climate scientists agree that the climate change deniers, it's not that they're wrong, it's that they're not using scientific methods to come to their conclusions.
Okay.
So it's not, I disagree with your answer, it's, I disagree with how you got to your answer. Because if they used scientific method and they said, hey, wait a second, here's some conflicts, here's all the science, the methodology matches out, then we can have a more like conversation. But if you're just saying like, oh, well, the climate's always changing, and it's like, that's not science.
There are some, what is the name of those?
That's rhetoric.
There's several 100-year cycles. There are people trying to do what you're saying and say, oh, look, it's just these cycles. But the problem is when you actually look at those cycles, you're like, okay, that's great. But those cycles take hundreds of years, and the changes we're seeing are less than a century. Yeah. So this, obviously, the change we're seeing is not from, I forget the name of those cycles right now, but there's like a 400-year cycle of warming and cooling.
Yeah, we had like a mini ice age in like the Middle Ages.
There's actually some interesting research I saw way back that, I mean, there's some very big downsides we're starting to see with climate change. But since the dawn of agriculture, we have been modifying the climate, and we were due for an ice age, which we avoided. Now, the problem is we avoided it too hard at this point. So the good part is over, and now it's just the penalty for taking it too far. But anyway, separate podcast.
We are running out of time. So any closing thoughts?
I think let's look at our topics. We covered most of that. I think we gave it a pretty thorough open sourcing models and training data. I think we covered that well.
I think one of the things I would close with is just from our entire discussion today, you can tell how difficult it is to separate the technical aspects of AI and machine learning from the social aspects of it. And it forces us to come face to face with things that we may or may not agree with. And we have to tackle those conversations head on. Like some of the stuff that we brought up were more social, some of them were political. And it's very difficult because AI is an accelerant. We're pouring jet fuel on a fire, but is it the right fire? And are we pouring it in a responsible way? So we have to have these conversations because I don't want somebody to say, I'm not racist. The AI told me to do it. And this is a real thing that we're running into.
Oh, yeah.
Like
the math washing is the term I've heard.
The math washing.
Oh, no, it's the math. It's the algorithm.
The math washing is behind it.
Because it's an
how
algorithm.
we're collecting data, like there's bias that gets involved in that. We see that already with traditional statistics, where you have collection bias, you have survival bias, you have like just different ways of biases. And we need to make sure that when we're collecting information and we're trying to train like artificial intelligence, that we're not integrating that bias in there, because you and I might be much more equipped to identify like, oh, that's bias, let me discount that. But AI is just, I don't know if I'm looking at a sheep or a grass, but I see grass, and usually all the pictures of sheep you show me have grass, so it has to be a sheep.
Yeah.
And so like, that's a thing that we need to consider.
I do agree with you that we definitely, it's tech generally, not just AI. It's an extreme example, but tech is an accelerant. And the problem is, I think humanity at this point, we have outstripped, we've gotten a lot better at collecting knowledge, but we've gotten a lot worse at transmitting wisdom, right? How and when should we apply that knowledge for our collective good? We're terrible at that. And we have people, oh, look, I can, because I've heard people like when cryptocurrency was the thing, and the same arguments being applied to AI, you know, I had people tell me like, oh, you can make a lot of money, because I'm like, yeah, there's these problems, but you can make a lot of money. And my response, chosen, you know, to be extreme on purpose, was, yeah, I could also make a lot of money trafficking people. And I'm not going to do either one of those things for the same reason, because they're both awful, morally reprehensible things, right? And so this idea that just looking at you could make a lot of money is justification for so much. And it's like, yes, but if you look at, there's lots of ways, like beating the stock market. You can reliably beat the stock market with insider trading, which is why it's illegal. So there's lots of illegal ways to make a lot of money, and we've made them illegal because we're like, yeah, no, that works great for the person who's doing it, but it does too much damage to the rest of society, so we're not going to let that happen. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. We've just, to a lesser and lesser degree, we've looked at what is the damage that will come to society from this. And as long as someone can benefit in a short term, we just kind of don't really care what the damage is at this point in a lot of areas. And we need to think about that more.
I always think of the tragedy of the commons. The commons, the idea is like, here's an island, it's got a bunch of deer and a bunch of grass. And like each deer, if they ate the same amount, they would survive on this island, no problem. But once certain deer start looking out for themselves, it starts to create a scarcity, and now you don't have enough food. And so everybody, it kind of cascades. Like everybody starts looking out for themselves. But now this island that had enough food for everybody, only some people are getting food, other people are starving, and that's an economic principle. Like that's not even
and that's
politics.
That
like,
idea
that's an
of
economic
scarcity.
principle. Yeah.
Like I actually wrote a whole article that it was up on egx.org. Now it's on techedcollab.org because we move everything over. But we have a whole article called An Abundance of Scarcity, and it discusses the core idea, because I've had so many people, again, thank God cryptocurrency's finally dying mostly. It's going to be around for a while, but it's
gonna be
dying. The pulse is weakening. But the core idea, right? Humanity has always faced scarcity, and then we've developed technology as a way of like, oh, agriculture, and now we can store food and preservatives and all this. It has helped us do more with less resources or with the same amount. So that's been our way around scarcity, is technology. And we've hit an inflection point where we're like, what if we invented digital scarcity? Even though there is no scarcity, digital, right, is all copying bits. Copying bits is how the computer, like all of it acts that way. There's basically zero cost to copying bits. As many copies as you want of a digital good, whether you have one copy or 100 billion copies, the cost is roughly the same, right? So the idea of then wasting all of this energy, like countries worth of energy, to create digital scarcity, like this is we talked about genocide a little bit earlier, a lot of happy topics this podcast, right? But genocide is bad. We keep doing it. We should stop. But the idea of creating, instead of using technology to get around scarcity, but to create scarcity with technology while destroying real resources, like genocide pales in comparison to how stupid and destructive an idea of this that is. Like, and that was taken seriously until like the last year or two when FTX and some of this collapsed. And so it really worries me for the future, the fact that these terrible ideas, like as a society, collectively suicidal ideas, those are being embraced and promoted as like, oh, it's the best thing ever. It's going to revolutionize the world. It's like, no, it's going to end the world. Let's not. Let's look at, again, let's have the wisdom. We got all these people, about 8 billion on the planet. How do we have the finite resources that we have here? How do we ensure a good quality of life for all of them? We have enough resources. We have the technology to do it. Do we have the will?
And that's a good question.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you guys. That was really great. Just want to close off and say, watch our other videos, and you can follow
NetSec Explained.
NetSec, yep. And then you have your own website.
Yeah, right now I'm aggregating all my other websites, aliogrieco.com. I should probably
Tell
spell
them.
that, but we'll put a link.
You should
So
spell that.
come on by. Yeah, yeah, because no one can spell mine. ELIOGRIECO.com. And I got Doomsday Machines, which is in progress. I got what's the other one? Correct by Construction, trying to say how do we take software
Yeah, your
and build
formal
bug free.
proofs.
I got a whole bunch of others that I might be debuting a few other sites, but all of it will be tracked. And I got to put a link to my photography. I got some cool pictures of Arizona
you
on
go.
there. So yeah, thank you,
And I want
man.
to thank our sponsor.
Yeah,
We're not actually sponsored.
If
but-
only, that'd be great. Send me some bucks.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, everybody.
See you guys later.